Good morning and welcome to Morning Scoop for Monday, June 20th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 75 days, the game against Michigan in 159 days. On Monday afternoon, the Buckeyes will find out if they will land a commitment from five-star wide receiver Cardinal Tate. That is a recruitment that has taken more than a few twists and turns over the past year. We're going to chat about that for a minute before we get into the main topic of today's show. My guest today is Tony Gerdeman. We host the Buckeye Weekly podcast together. We actually got to hang out in person last week at the 7-on-7 camp for the first time in what feels like maybe since the Rose Bowl. It has been a hot minute. Tony, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Tom. It is always a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, Cardinal Tate, as I mentioned, announcing his decision 1 o'clock Monday afternoon. The consensus across the recruiting industry is that things are trending towards Ohio State after a while where it looks like Tennessee and its NIL collective were making a pretty serious run at him. Now, Tony, assuming Tate does end up committing to the Buckeyes, that feels like that might go a little ways towards addressing some of the more hysterical overreactions about how NIL collectives were just going to win every single recruitment forever and this was the end of college football.
Yeah, there was no way to combat them, and certainly not through development and future NFL production type earnings and things like that. And yet, if Tate does end up a Buckeye, I think this is a win for the people who are not so fearful of what NIL is or how NIL is going to ruin the sport or anything like that. And I think it would be a huge win for Ohio State in that they aren't they're playing their own kind of NIL game, and Tennessee and others are trying to play another. And so, if you're able to beat them, not even at their game, but your own game, while you're kind of playing two different games, I think that would be a huge win for Ohio State. And like you said, signs are pointing towards the Buckeyes, and if that holds true, I think that's kind of a hit for the NIL panickers.
Yeah, and I think we've had the conversation before about the development programs maybe not needing to go as cash tornado machine centric as the Texases or the Tennessees or even Texas A&M and to some degree, where if you're Alabama or you're Ohio State and you can say, look at all the people we've put in the first round, like you'll get your money, don't worry. You don't necessarily need to go quite as full cash tornado as a Tennessee program that doesn't have, hey, you're going to win football games or championships or go to the college football playoff or get drafted really high. So we've talked about that in the past. We're going to talk a bunch more about that, assuming Tate does in fact commit to Ohio State on Monday. Tony and I are going to have a whole episode of the Buckeye Weekly all about him, where he fits in the class, what kind of a role he might play for the Buckeyes, and of course a deeper dive on what it might mean for NIL-related concerns moving forward. You can find that show wherever you're listening to this. Just search for Buckeye Weekly or Buckeye Scoop to subscribe so you get that episode as soon as it drops. Again, if he commits on Monday at 1 o'clock, that will be out early Monday afternoon. Now on to the main topic of today's show, which is one of the great landmarks of the college football offseason, the release of the Phil Steele annual preview magazine. That's coming up in a matter of days. The official newsstand date is June 28th, so just over a little week away, but it's usually at Barnes & Noble's a little before that. Tony and I, however, both got the early release digital copies, and that's either because we're extremely, extremely important or because we paid for the Phil Steele Plus package. It's impossible to say which. But we have had a chance to read through it and look through the magazine even before the hard copy gets in our hands. Had a few things that really jumped out to us that we're going to be talking about today. Tony, why don't you go ahead and give us one, and then we sort of compared notes a little bit beforehand, so you can go through with one of yours, and then I'll share one of mine.
First, Tom, let me just mention something that we didn't address before the show, and this is my roster rant about an in-depth chart rant about what Phil Steele puts on the page. Because again, love the book, get it every year, and can't live without it. However, he is listed like 11 walk-ons on defense and like 12 walk-ons on offense for the Buckeyes in his depth chart area. And no offense to walk-ons, but that is information that has also been placed in other areas in the magazine, like on the pages. That is information that I would rather have be data about players who have played and what they've done, like numbers, statistics, starts, games. I much prefer that as opposed to all of these names that some of these names aren't even on Ohio State's roster, and walk-on names change. And so that's just my initial, I prefer more pertinent data, because now if I go look at another team, I don't know, like, are these guys in the back end? Are these all walk-ons too, just like they are at Ohio State? And again, No offense to walk-ons, but only a couple of them played for Ohio State last year. So I don't know that there's this huge need to put them all in the 4 deep, 5 deep that he has, especially when there's another area to put them in, which he does. But Tom, let me that's that. Let me just I'm done with that. Another one that I did not address with you, which we can talk about. He has 4 all Big Ten teams: first team, second team, third team, and fourth team. There is only one Ohio State wide receiver listed on any of those 4 teams. And to me, that is a great slight to any of Marvin Harrison, Emeka Egbuka, or Julian Fleming, because I think any of those 4 could show up there. I think you've got 3 Penn State receivers listed, 2 Michigan receivers listed, maybe 2 or 3 Maryland receivers listed. And if I'm just going to pick out one Ohio State receiver other than Jackson Smith and Jigba, this is a huge slight to Marvin Harrison, especially given how much Ohio State throws the ball, the numbers that the receivers put up for there only to be one receiver listed among 12 different receivers. I think that will be proven wrong.
I don't know if our listeners have picked this up over the years, but you pay so much more attention to the all Big Ten teams than I do. Like you always ask me, and it's kind of like, I don't know. I could not tell you more than, like, I'm sure CJ Stroud won the most outstanding player last year. But other than that, I barely pay any attention to those. But that being said, yeah, that seems real low. Like, it seems like there's a better chance that if they go 3 deep, right, for the Big Ten, like the official Big Ten, or it's 3 deep,
Yeah.
and then an honorable mention.
Honorable mention.
I think there's a better chance that you have 4 Ohio State wide receivers on those teams than 1. If Ohio State has 1, I mean, he has CJ Stroud listed as, one of his best quarterbacks in the country. I think he was second in the country behind Bryce Young. If CJ Stroud only has 1 wide receiver on the all Big Ten teams, something has gone catastrophically wrong, probably involving CJ Stroud not playing very much, because you're going to have production, and generally, if you have numbers and you play for a team that's on TV a lot, you're going to end up getting on some of those teams, and you're going to have production, you're going to have numbers from those guys, and they're going to be on TV a bunch. So, yeah, I would be pretty surprised at that. Wasn't there something with Denzel Burke? Was Denzel Burke not on the all Big Ten teams on there?
Well, and last year he was like 3rd team, not Phil Steele, but like in the voting.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of where Phil has him this year, I believe that is a second team. No, Tom, I have it right here. I can bring it up. Yeah, second team. And I understand that. I understand it because you've got Joey Porter at Penn State, who we all like. Riley Moss at Iowa, also very good. So I still expect Denzel Burke to be among them, because voting eventually is just for defensive backs, not necessarily corners and safeties, as it is done in the Big Ten. Now Phil here is doing it in a safety and corner separation.
All right, so yeah, that's reasonable. Yeah, second team for Denzel Burke is very, very reasonable, because yeah, you're right. I mean, those 2 guys ahead of him. I don't know that I would bet on either of those guys to get drafted earlier than Denzel Burke does. Obviously they'll get picked probably next year, and then Burke has another year. But if you're asking me which guy gets picked earliest in the draft, when do they get picked, I'm picking Denzel Burke. But second team, the 3rd best cornerback in the Big Ten. That's a reasonable spot to have him right now. I looked at some of the overall stats and his overall rankings of teams. He ranks the best rushing defense, the best passing defense, the best rushing offense, the best passing offense, the biggest best overall, worst overall offense and defense, and then he also does the most improved and least improved, or most unimproved, I guess. Ohio State is number 6 in the most improved pass defenses. Alabama is number 8. Boy, you're going to hear a lot about those 2 schools. Phil is very high on both of those schools. I think everyone's very high on both of those schools. But the most interesting thing to me on that one, Wisconsin is number 128. So Wisconsin probably taking a pretty big step back. That's probably not a good, even if Ohio State does have just one all Big Ten wide receiver, that's probably not a great thing with Ohio State on the schedule for Wisconsin. The Buckeyes ranked very highly, kind of across the board there. Number 2 projected pass offense behind only Western Kentucky, which I don't quite get that one because Bailey Zappi's gone, so maybe they can pull another rabbit out of the hat there. But number 1 projected scoring offense, number 1 projected overall offense. Ohio State overall, number 1 projected offense overall, number 9 projected defense overall, so top 10 on both sides of the ball. Alabama has the number 2 offense, number 1 defense. Georgia was the only other team that was top 10 in both sides. They were number 5 and number 5. One of the really interesting things that jumped out to me, Tony, though, Michigan, which really did it a lot with defense last year, projected the number 3 overall offense in the country this year, behind only Ohio State and Alabama. That one kind of jumped out to me as, yeah, they'll probably put up some pretty numbers because they play a terrible schedule this year. But I mean, do you see Michigan actually having the 3rd best offense in the country this year?
No, and this is one of those things where Phil really, really trusts his numbers and his formulas and things like that, and that's all well and good. But if I get something that spits out Michigan is going to have the 3rd best offense, I'm like, well, I better go back over these numbers because that's just not something that Jim Harbaugh has done. Now, going back, 2016, Michigan had a pretty good offense. They were number 11 in scoring offense that year. So there's it's not like they're always grinding it out and scoring 27 points a game or whatever. Last year they were 16th in the nation in scoring. So they're in the, I don't know, not even area code, but like you can get there in a day's drive type of thing. But 3rd overall, I don't know any metric where Michigan is going to be 3rd nationally in offense in anything because they don't just snap the ball enough to have the highest scoring offense or the 3rd highest scoring offense. They don't throw it enough to have that type of passing offense. They don't run it well enough, and they ran it well last year, but it still wasn't one of the best rush offenses in the nation because it's one dimensional at times, and if you're one dimensional, it's easier to stop. I just think overall, and you don't even know if you're starting your best quarterback at that point either this season with Cade McNamara. So I think there's just so many questions. I don't understand it, and maybe it's one of those things where he's like, I don't understand this, but I understand my numbers, and so I'm going to go with it. I'm Phil Steele. I can do what I want.
And he does end up more or less correct an awful lot of the time. So, there is some history behind those numbers working out. And, you and I did not, we did not have the Ohio State Michigan game predicted correctly last year. So we'll see how that shakes out. The numbers may end up looking very pretty. I don't know. I think you will hit a wall with that offense where last year, the offense looked pretty okay for a while and looked very good against Ohio State, and then boy, they ran into Georgia, and then the offense didn't work anymore. So look great against Ohio State and Iowa, and then you may run into a talent problem at some point there with that offense. So we'll have to keep an eye on that one. One other thing that jumped out to me was Ohio State plays his number 5 team, Michigan, his number 7 team, Notre Dame, number 19, Wisconsin, number 20, Iowa, number 22, Penn State, number 23, Michigan State. 2 top 10 teams, 4 top 20 teams, 6 top 25 teams. That's half the schedule. Here's the other half of the schedule. Toledo, which he has picked to win the MAC West. So they're, you figure that's probably 50th, give or take, something like that. Maryland, which is predicted kind of towards the bottom of the Big Ten East, and I think it was 75th overall, something like that in projected margin of scoring margin. Arkansas State, which is 6th in the Sun Belt West, not great. And then the 3 worst projected teams in the Big Ten, Indiana, Northwestern, Rutgers, also on the schedule. So it feels like this is going to be, half the schedule is going to be like, wow, really good games, exciting, top 25 kind of matchups. And then Toledo should be pretty okay. And then you're going to have maybe 4 or 5 games that are just woof again this year.
Yeah, and the quality of opponent, I'm wondering if like those teams, Ohio State's top opponents, are closer in range than they are to Ohio State, like in range to each other. Like number 6 is closer to 25 than Ohio State is to number 6, that type of thing, where the gap between Ohio State and everybody else is just really wide. But I think the quality of opponents is good for obviously strength of schedule in those discussions. It will be interesting, Tom, when the college football playoff voting, the ballots begin, and you start to see these teams ranked at like 22, do they fall out of the rankings so that Kentucky can move in or so that Arkansas can move in? And we get to watch that dance every year as the committee manipulates who they want to be where. So I think it's obviously good to have so many teams. If those teams can stay towards the top and they have two losses, one or two losses, and one of them is obviously to Ohio State, that's hard to ignore. It's when the third and the fourth loss get in there where you can justify kind of moving teams down. But yeah, it's an interesting schedule in that it's it's sneakier than I think a lot of people are giving it credit for. Ohio State never has to play Ohio State, so they kind of get dinged by that. But there are still some teams that would trip up a lot of other good teams around the nation.
Yeah, there's enough good teams. You, I think, had the point nailed exactly there. I mean, we talked about 4 top 20, 6 top 25, except it's only 2 top 18. So you've got 4 teams in that 19, 20, 22, 23 kind of range where you're exactly right. You look at the rest of the college football playoff picture come the end of October where they're trying to rank those teams. We have a long-standing theory that we've put forth on this show before. If you want to know what the committee is really trying to do at the top of the poll, look at the bottom of the poll, because you'll have years where Minnesota ends up 8-4, and if Minnesota is number 25, well then that's a quality win for someone. Or if Michigan State is 25, that's a top 25 win for someone, and if they finish 26, well that's now you have one less top 25 win, and that's one of the metrics they really use. I don't feel like they're going to be looking for an excuse to put Ohio State out of the playoff, but that's always one of those things you just kind of keep an eye on in terms of figuring out what they're really thinking, what they really want to do. Did you have one more that you wanted to share before we get going?
Well, I think one of the things that struck me was the lack of returning production defensively for Michigan, which we know, we understand, but they have 47.2% of their tackles returning, which is 110th nationally. They have 33.2% of their tackles for loss, sacks, and interceptions returning, which is 128th nationally. Of note, there are 131 teams in the rankings, I believe. So almost every team in the nation brings back more production defensively than Michigan, and they have lost their very best players, and it's going to be really, really difficult to replace David Ojabo, Aiden Hutchinson. I do like linebacker Junior Colson, but they've lost so much. Dax Hill at safety, a more than just a safety. He was a do-it-all guy. He can play corner, could do nickel, could do safety. They may need 3 different guys to do what he did last year. And if they try to use one, that's going to be a very difficult ask. And if you ask somebody to do 3 different things that they're not qualified to do, they could fail at every single one of those things. So while the focus goes on the defensive line, don't forget about Daxton Hill not coming back and what that means and who replaces him and how they replace him.
Yeah, that's definitely one to keep an eye on. Michigan just feels like they are a team where the stats sort of say one thing, and if that holds true, they're going to have one kind of a season, and if the stats don't hold true, they're going to have a very different kind of a season and not the kind of season they necessarily want to have. Before we go, there were a couple of very funny things that I apparently completely forgot about between the last bowl season and now that I looked, and one of them I went, oh yeah, I forgot about that, and the other one I went, I have no recollection of this whatsoever. One, Rutgers going 5-7 and being the emergency last minute replacement for the Gator Bowl and just getting destroyed by Wake Forest on like 48 hours notice. One of the weirder college football games. That was one we watched out in California, and that was not really a fair position for Rutgers to get put in because they had not been practicing and just kind of got thrown on a plane and hauled away from their family Christmases and thrown on an airplane and here, go lose to Wake Forest. And they did. That was number 1. Number 2, Maryland beat Virginia Tech 54-10 in the Pinstripe Bowl. I have no recollection of this. Like, whatever the opposite of the Mandela effect is, where you remember something that didn't happen, I have no we watched lots of college football while we were out at the Rose Bowl. This game allegedly happened. I have no recollection of this whatsoever. A couple other interesting stats that Nebraska is good for a bunch of real good, interesting stats because they've had such a weird couple seasons. Number 1, they are 5-20 in one-score games under Scott Frost. Like, that's something that typically evens out to about 500 over time. 5-20 in one-score games. It is not just luck, though. Here is their rankings in special teams since 2016. 105th, 54th, 94th, 111th, 112th, 129th. It is probably not a surprise, Tony. Nebraska has a new special teams coordinator this year. That is, I mean, punting and field position and all that wins games. Oh boy, bad special teams that can lose you some close games too.
Ohio State has the plan to win that Urban Meyer brought that was about field position, and that starts with special teams. Jim Tressel talked about the punt being the most important play in football. It changes the field position more than anything else. And you scoff at it, you laugh at it, and then you see what happens when you don't embrace those things, and you become a team that loses by one score, by one possession, by being a little bit too far out from the end zone one last time.
By having a kickoff return that, was a punt return? It was something in that season opening when guy fielded must either a kickoff or a punt at the 2-yard line and somehow took a safety on a kickoff return, I think. It must have been a punt return, but yeah, just little stuff like that. You want to lose to Illinois? That's how you lose to Illinois. Nebraska this year opens the season playing Northwestern in Dublin, Ireland. Boy, that is a game they have to win. You don't usually have must-win games in week one. If Nebraska loses that one, they may not let Scott Frost get back on the plane. He may live in Ireland then. So that'll be a fun one to watch. Again, the Phil Steele magazine's official release date is June 28th. You can also order that at philsteele.com. We'll probably have Phil on at some point in the coming weeks to talk about some of his thinking behind this stuff, get some more national preview. We kind of focus mostly on the Big Ten here, but always love reading Phil's stuff. Always find Phil's stuff worth paying for. We may do a whole separate show just on his historical point spread data. There is some fascinating stuff. He's got stuff going back to the mid-'70s. Some really, really fascinating stuff. If you were into college football history, we'll probably do a show on that at some point in the coming weeks. So that'll do it for today. Keep an eye out for a Buckeye Weekly emergency episode if and when Cardinal Tate commits to the Buckeyes on Monday afternoon. You can find that where you find all of our great podcasts, which is right here. Wherever you're listening to this, just search Buckeye Scoop, and that will get you all of our shows. The Buckeye Weekly show that Tony and I do, Gives in the Bank with Mark Givler and Bill the Bank Green, Around the Oval with Alex Gleitman, and Big Me Kickoff with Kevin Noon. You can find all of those wherever you find this. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find them all. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.